Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jui, and on behalf of the Guild Art Gallery, I welcome you to this podcast on cognitive processes, imagining ecological democracy. I'd like to introduce our speakers today, curators Amrita Gupta and Najrin Islam, and artist Navjot Altaf. Amrita Gupta is an art historian, researcher, and writer involved in art education, archiving, and cultural management. She has contributed art writings for various art books, journals, and periodicals, such as Hakara Journal, Art India, Take, Critical Collective, among others, and is the author of Unbox, a workbook on contemporary art for children, as well as the editor of the first volume of the Artist Educator series, Paradigms of Creative Pedagogy, Children as Makers, published in 2021. Najrin Islam is a writer and curator, currently based between Kolkata and New Delhi. Her writings have been published on various platforms, including Alternative South Asia Photography and Art, Critical Collective, Photo South Asia, Projects, Processes, and 5 Million Incidents curated by Rux Media Collective. In 2019, she was awarded the Art Writers Award by Take on Art magazine and Swiss Arts Council Pro Helvetia, and in 2020, the Generalities Performance Fellowship by the Reframe Institute of Art and Expression. Navjot Altaf is a transcultural artist whose inventive multimedia work reflects political and aesthetic concerns that have been informed by dialogical ways of working. Her practice is located in the metaphor of flow, across materiality and theory, across place and people, and in finding a transdisciplinary perspective where inquiry and self-inquiry intersect. She is one of the founder members of a center, Dialogue Interactive Arts Association, based in Kondagaon, Chhattisgarh. Welcome, Navjot. Navjot recently presented her solo exhibition, Cognitive Processes, Imagining Ecological Democracy at the Guild Alibaug 2022. Cognitive Processes is an examination of the interdependency of human and non-human life and the intersectionality between natural systems, terminology, and community growth. Without further ado, let us have the beginning of this discussion.
Thank you, Jui, for this kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon today to speak with Navjot Altaf and Najrin Islam on the processes in the making of the latest exhibition, Cognitive Processes, Imagining Ecological Democracy. I will start with a few questions, after which Najrin will follow up with her questions, and we look forward to a very robust conversation today. So Navjot, it's a pleasure to be here and speaking to you today. And I would like to begin the discussion with the first question. Navjot, as a transcultural artist, your oeuvre is located in the metaphor of flow, like river systems, and the Marxian logic that nothing is static. In the context of ecology, the theory of constructal law by Andre and Bijan is one of the things that has interested you. We could enter your current body of work, Cognitive Processes, Imagining Ecological Democracy, through this lens, alongside Edgar Morin's method of complexity that builds connection and dialogue between the isolated bodies of human knowledge. Can you elaborate, please?
Thank you, Amrita. Amrita, I would like to begin with how this series of works evolved. So it was from my interest in understanding the concept of ecological democracy in relation to representative democracy, which we have been experiencing is not always liberal or unprejudiced, and it has not managed to work ethically or constitutionally on a large scale in the socio-political system. Forget about thinking of rest of the life forms on the planet. Also during pandemic, as there was much discussion about clinical research to provide relief, you might have noticed that there was little or no attention given to the protection of people's immune system and linking it to other life forms. So this was in my mind, which made me more interested in exploring how human body has much in common with the rest of the living world, and how our lives and lives of other organisms function and depend on democratic principles of communication, and how the loss of diversity and extermination of species is also happening to human gut or soil microbiotas that affect our health, and how microbes are present in all life forms and are found everywhere, even where nothing can exist. So, in the context of ecology, when one reflects critically on human achievements, one can't really overlook the fact that all human induced changes have not been beneficial. And we can see how the model and the procedures of development over years, intended for the growth and well being of the societies and the economy, have in reality come with modifications that are disturbing and have been straining the resilience of the ecosystems as well as, producing the economic inequalities. So I feel that there's a need for us to internalize the fact that if we are imagining a long-term sustainability for all life forms on the earth, the development procedures cannot be seen in isolation, from the ecosystem, because we are linked to the planet and we are interconnected and interdependent. So you see, the ecological democracy manifests the entwined nature of socio-ecological systems and points out that these systems function as part of the ecosystem and are dependent on it. So to respond to your question, I would say that it has become necessary for us to be aware of complexity of links and a system of relations, you see. Whatever I know through the research studies from different disciplines, it leads me to reflect more on the indigenous perceptions of human nature relationships. So I'm interested in learning from different knowledge systems, as it helps one to think and rethink how one knows what one knows or doesn't know. As you mentioned, Edgar Morin's idea of complexity and method of inquiry, self-reflection or self-inquiry in inquiry, makes sense to me, as in collaborations with people from different disciplines and socio-cultural and economic backgrounds, such an approach encourages one to disallow, to be limited by one's conditioning or ideological boundaries. You see, it's an ongoing process. My personal experience has been that one has to consciously learn how not to imply hierarchical approach and to consciously reject any construction and implementation of aesthetics or any kind of hierarchy and judgment as such, and a process which is inclusive of people's participation demands respect for the unanticipated outcomes or what emerges out of the entire processes. So in Bastar, Dialogue Center is a place created to interact with people from different age groups and with people from the local areas and outside. Idea is to encourage multidimensional thinking and respect for diversity.
Thank you, Navjot, for that introduction. And you have outlined what the way you look at ecological democracy, or how you have understood ecological democracy. I'd like to now go back a little back to your thinking processes and your reading. For example, in each detour of your career has been buttressed by deep questioning across materiality and theory, across place and people, and also finding a transdisciplinary perspective which is also related to the kind of work that Edgar Morin and others have done in transdisciplinary studies. So I'd like to ask you a question of your ideological positions, particularly in the early years, where your positions moved through Marxism in the 1970s to feminism in the 1980s, 90s, and ecofeminism from the early 2000s onwards. And that also informed your adjacent practice with Adivasi artists in Bastar. And it's interesting that your feminist consciousness in turn evolved as a critique of Indian Marxism, and your present study of ecological democracy can be traced to an eco-feminist base. Can you please trace these intellectual roots? And it's interesting that the shifts and detours that have happened have also been deeply shaped by a lot of thinking around yourself, your own life experiences, that also shaped the kind of work that you've done over the years. So can you talk about this?
So in the 70s, when I began, I was trying to understand the characteristics of human domination and exploitation, and how the man-made asymmetries were introduced in human relations, which over period I understood are distinct from the natural asymmetry of relations. And how social conditions are created by hierarchy or a specific social order which gives some people the power over the rest to treat or to use them without regard to their individual identities. Then the early women's movements and women's studies brought forth how the social systems and ideological schemas sustained the domination of men over women. And then ecofeminism and feminist environmentalism, which acknowledge the effects of environmental degradation on women. So, environmental destruction also has its origin in hierarchy. So, by exploring hierarchy in its various forms, we can see how the systems or patterns created by uneven divides amongst humans and between humans and non-humans have caused environmental crisis. So ecological democracy, as I understand and I mentioned before, speaks of the entwined nature of socio-ecological systems and how these systems function as part of the ecosystem and are dependent on it. So I agree with the thought of ensuring the interests of non-humans and future generations, and which should be represented in decision making, and in kin-centric philosophy, human is viewed as one aspect of the complexity of life. The kin means all members of an ecosystem. So through my own experience of being with Adivasi communities, I can perhaps say that I could sense specifically when I first saw a dance performance, Kokerenge. Kokerenge means cock-like walk. I saw this way back in 1998. Concept of relation with other than human has been part of the wisdom of Adivasi, as their knowledge has stemmed from centuries-long observation and interaction with nature. So some of the works in the series have evolved from all these queries and concerns and interests.
Thank you so much, Navjot, for illuminating your focus on non-hierarchical alliances, especially the notion that uneven divides, an observation rather, that uneven divides create patterns of hierarchy and destruction. My question to you pertains to your work process, particularly your body of work that's up on display as part of the exhibition Cognitive Processes. The multiple lockdowns during COVID-19 witnessed massive institutional failures that resulted in mass migrations on foot, farmers' protests, and also the use of communal unrest by institutions to suppress marginalized bodies. You have created this series of works during the pause engineered by the pandemic, and these events have visibly percolated into your work as both direct references and reflective tangents. I was wondering, how would you articulate this process? Through what artistic conduit did the events transfer to your work?
See, a time like that had disrupted lives of almost all the people everywhere. And many were at a high risk and vulnerable to anxious and stressful situations. To me, the world seemed to be collectively confronting the consequences of its doing. And as you mentioned, there were a number of political protests going on against the right-wing majoritarian governance before and after the lockdown was imposed. So I was watching TV more than ever during that time. So over a period, I realized that I had got into collecting images and information on the issues I found engaging from the TV and other online sources. And later, while reflecting on my perceptions of the situation, about my feelings and about my doubts, I thought of these works. And since one was observing things without much physical contact outside, I thought of using the material derived from the television, internet, or printed media, which are copies, and some from my own archive, consisting of photographs, mostly taken by me, or images and text collected over period. What I find very interesting is that when one starts, one's brain starts to edit intuitively. And I allow that play to begin with. But the process of pausing and reflecting or critical reflection, I think, is as essential because the complexity of situation one is trying to address demands looking at things in a larger perspective. For example, in some of these works, if I have tried to look at the human struggle of achievements or the breakdown of environment, conflicts or contradictions, it could not have been viewed in isolation.
Thank you, Navjot, for your response. My next question pertains to a formal aspect of your work. Your work uses an architectural imaginary to map concerns around ecological mutations. Your puncturing of the modernist grid, especially, is interesting as a subversive use of the spatio-temporal axis. Could you speak a bit about this image-based cartography of index, impulse, and insight in your work? You have also used abstraction visually with a political edge in your body of work. So please tell us how you have employed abstraction in this series.
You see, I'm interested in the process of making and experiencing art. The challenges one faces in different conditions and the context one works in. And I find it interesting how, while thinking of one thing, another thought, maybe unrelated, enters in subconsciously. For example, in one of the work, the image of the hack tree is not that of a sal tree, but while selecting the image, what splashed through my mind at that moment was a sal forest in flowering period in Bastar, which is March to May, and most of the time I'm there in those months. So I retained it. And juxtaposition of certain images are intended to create associative connotations, symbolism, and layered imagery to create a sense of visible or invisible or clear and diffused imaging, Also included are image of forest mensuration to measure the dimensions of the tree in the forest, or thermometers to measure the climate change. A concrete road divider, for example, I see as a sign of urbanism, as much of the mine material is transported to the cities for which countless trees are cut to build and broaden roads. And you experience it when you are traveling from one place to another. For example, if I'm going from Raipur to Korba, throughout that journey, you see how roads are being broadened and how many trees are, continuously cut. Associations are also generated by the repeated image of a glass of water, birds, insects, and water bodies, and text from an oral epic. Also, the signs which instill fear of a reflection from nature, by unwanted interferences, as in the work titled Kashmir, in which, apart from the images of a bird, a flower, an animal, and the tree in all four corners and a UNO symbol on which is placed a blurred military figure. What is also added very clearly is a land acquisition sign superimposed on one of the police safety device. Because since the special status under Article 370 has been withdrawn, anyone from outside Jammu and Kashmir can acquire land there. So the fear and concern addressed here is whether the land acquired by the government or others will destroy the environment. As you know, we have clear evidences from other parts of India of industrial projects which have destroyed the ecology of the areas that local habitants had conserved for hundreds and thousands of years and who were never ever in agreement with the government decisions. Najrin, I always find it difficult to explain the use of abstraction in my work. Here in these series, superimpositions of the graphs of different densities and sharpness over the surface, which comprises of many images of specific situations and issues addressed, is to evoke curiosity. How does one sense these situations as reality is led? How does one engage its complexity, So the cuts or the openings in certain parts of the graphs, if you notice, indicate artist's gesture to look into and enter through the found openings and to create new openings, which is a process. And the viewer is invited.
I think just to insert here regarding the abstraction question, I think in the discussion, Najrin, if you would like to, expand on it, that would be nice. And if Navjot has something to say, I can also add in something to this.
By expand, do you have anything specific in mind?
Yeah, I mean, basically, in terms of the way she has used abstraction is also deeply related to her understanding of Western modernism. So because she has been trained in Western modernism and how she employs the grid and then also the blur, the image blurring or what is legible and what is not legible. Basically, the playing with perception. So I think that is one of the things that Navjot has brilliantly used in her work across a body of work. So basically, I think it's all the politics of perception. And maybe this is something you could perhaps ask in the discussion if you want to expand on the abstraction.
But Amrita, you can also bring this up actually, since you made this observation. When we begin the discussion, you can actually bring this up as well and we can take it up together.
Okay, sure. Navjot, is that all right?
Yeah, I prefer this, that somebody reads abstraction in my work rather than me trying to explain how I use it,
So maybe I'll now just come to my question and then we can open it out to a free-flowing conversation. So Navjot, through this lens of kin-centric philosophy, you have also examined contemporary debates about human exceptionalism and the turn to multi-species equity where both the human and the non-human have equal rights on the planet. And such entanglements with other living selves urge public engagement with ecological sustenance, where organisms on the margins are deeply tied to human life, politics, and cultures. The visual sign of this is the sculptural rendition of soil and gut microbiotas that has been arranged in a circular form. And in many ways, the circularity or the spiral and the kin-centric, form also merge here conceptually. So can you expand on this? Because it's interesting that when you've looked at microbiotas, it's also about doing very different kinds of artistic research, going to different kinds of readings across science and the arts. And so it'd be very interesting if you could, tell us more here.
Amrita, as I've already mentioned, these works have evolved from my deep interest in understanding how our lives like other life forms depend upon laws of ecology and communication, as ecosystems are made up of all living beings on earth, and how microorganisms are in constant interaction between themselves and are everywhere in the soil, water, air, ice, everywhere. And how we humans are colonized by millions of living organisms known as human microbiota. So, this cultural work called microbiotas is to identify that the loss of diversity and extinctions is affecting human microbiotas as well, which build our immunity and health. And as far as form is concerned, what occurred to me first was a form of a circle, common in many indigenous cultures, signifying movement and continuity, also transformation. But I feel it also expresses the primary relationship of our world. I also thought of a circle because microscope lenses in the middle have a circular opening, and size of that opening specifies the circular field of view when one looks into microscope. I was thinking of installing the microscope in the exhibition space, which I didn't finally. And the third one emerged from the concept of circular society, that I was reading at that time. And I will read few lines from that essay. Circular concepts have the potential to challenge the prevalent capitalist principles of economic practices with alternative narratives that are rooted in environmental and social sustainability, social justice, solidarity, and communality. You see, this I find inspiring, and I feel that people from different fields are visualizing new horizons, for our relations to each other and with the planet.
Thank you, Navjot. To expand here on this whole notion of the circular or the spiral or a spiral argumentation in feminist thinking, and which also challenges capitalist grid, I would like to insert here. So it's interesting that, I would just like you to draw on, because the way all these works have come up is also about, even if it's, if you're responding to the local, there's also this planetary imagination or thinking about the planet in where, each and every living being and organism can live in a healthy way, So I think here also, if I would like to draw from Vandana Shiva's Earth Democracy, I think this is something where you are very interestingly talking about a kind of planetary imagination or planetary well-being, which is, I think, extremely very important in our current context. And the shifts in planetary systems is very, very evident, the kind of weather patterns and the kind of flooding and the kind of all kind of things that are happening all around us. It is an everyday experience. It's not something, a planetary imagination is not something that's out there. It is actually, everything is interconnected and we are part of this whole system.
You see, we've already experienced it so often now that we can't overlook the fact that we have gone overboard with the idea of progress or development. It's not that one is against development, but what kind of development is the question, and for whom? I absolutely agree with the critique, that human-induced activities need to be seen in relation to its effects on environment, which consists of various species. And as Vandana Shiva points out, we don't have to be the dominators, but partners with other life forms. So I personally like learning through different sources and through theoretical, philosophical, or psychological perspectives. Kin-centric philosophy interests me and one finds it in Adivasi consciousness, though may not be practiced by them at day-to-day level. But I like to share this, incident in Korba. During my research in a coal mine area, a woman, unfortunately, I don't have a recording of our conversation, but you see, her family was being forced to vacate their land. And she said that on government's record list, we may be 4 family members. But how are these people going to understand about rest of my family? Like my 2 cows, dogs, hens, and then she pointed towards her land and a small rocky hill and number of trees in it and said that I live with all of them. Are they going to give me all this? Later I learned that as the mine had come closer to her house, they were forcibly removed one night when it was raining heavily and there was no electricity. So you see, the relationship to land is rooted in a very different framework. I had similar experience when I closely observed farmers' struggle in Londigura area in Bastar against Tata Motors. As Tata Motors wanted to acquire land of 10 villages and the farmers were being forced. But they continued their resistance with the help of local activists, and finally they won. They speak of their relationship with land and how they are connected with it, not only physically but also spiritually and psychologically, as many of the rituals are connected with the land. These 10 villages are very close to Chitrakoot Falls, a beautiful site which is located on the Indravati River, and it is one of the most fertile area. So you can imagine the loss if they had lost their case. And one of the work in the series you have seen, a triptych, is about the recent farmers' resistance against political power, or how power could be resisted and reworked. Because the government finally had to withdraw the laws which, as you know, threatened to corporatize agriculture. So along with the triptych, the flag installation, which consists of 386 flags, is my tribute to the farmers' non-violent strike that lasted 386 days. And the words in different languages screen printed on the flags are reflections of a number of people who I had invited, like artists, art critics, activists, lawyers, social scientists, economists, etc., on the farmers' political stand and strategy and determination. I chose to install the flags outside in the open during heavy monsoon, to recognize or to signify how the farmers withstood all seasons during those 386 days long strike.
Najrin, would you like to add here?
Thanks so much, Navjot, for your response. There's something that I would like to talk about, and this came to me while you were illuminating your reflection, your observations with the examples that you were. At some point, you mentioned there being the necessity of the coexistence of multiple knowledge systems, and that led me to thinking about how that phrase could also be substituted with zones of entanglements, because we're talking about entanglements not only between the animate and the inanimate, but also the displacement on both microscopic and planetary scales, like Amrita pointed out. We are talking about a lot of entanglements when we talk about natural resources and the potential and unidirectional theft of resources that are enabled by unsustainable state policies. And all of this leads me to think about how, these entanglements sort of place kinship which you have also talked about, at the center. And I think along with kin, there's also, the body is also placed at the center in its precarious operativity, because the hierarchies that you talked about, while insisting on the need for non-hierarchical alliances, are constantly being reenacted on a systemic level. And these reenactments are not only harking back to a problematic past, but are also anticipating the same set of problems in the future. So yeah, I mean, this was a reflection while I had while listening to you, that you've also very effectively in your photo montages especially placed the body at the center alongside its kin-centric operativity. So would you like to speak about your photo montages specifically a bit more?
Well, the center figures are both human and non-human. For example, trees, insects, birds, animals, or even the devices like weather thermometers or machines, etc. I'll speak about few works. For example, in a work titled Hand Pulled Rickshaw, a male figure, a rickshaw puller in the city of Calcutta, is placed in the center. Then a female figure, single with a child, and an elderly woman behind her, who had to walk on foot to reach her village during lockdown without any support. And just below the male figure, you see a herd of cows. Years ago in Calcutta, while talking to a rickshaw puller, he told me that he had few cows and his family sold milk to earn their living in the village, but because the income was not enough, he had to work in Calcutta. So, while looking at how certain animals are being associated with specific castes or religions, how a single woman laborer from rural India in a city feels, about the opportunities of getting work and her safety. And then the old woman who had to walk on foot during the lockdown without any support. I was thinking of human-made democracies and its undemocratic approach to both human and non-human. So the work is about the relation to the uneven, prejudiced socio-political system that they inhabit. You see, the issues are entwined and linked. I was thinking how, being a Muslim, the rickshaw puller, perhaps out of fear, may not trust unknown persons and ever speak of his family business like this. As we have been seeing how people from certain castes and religions are being targeted by the right-wing politics and are being alienated from the culture of secularism. Then works like Man Carrying Man or From Where to Where and some others like Cycle or Auto or Cement Mixer are about the concerns for a section of citizens, whose vote is valuable and labor is vital for urban economies, and they're part of maintaining a large part of the city's infrastructures, including gutters or drainage cleaning in the most unhygienic conditions. But we saw how they had to struggle during and after the lockdown. Whereas they needed both psychological and financial support in those uncertain times. And if you remember, during that period, there were heavy rains and floods in some parts, and we saw both human and animals struggling to find some space or shelter. So there was this image I took from the TV and have incorporated of an elephant supporting the baby elephant to climb the divider on the road in a city. So you see, these images pose questions about capitalist economies and how they continuously are widening their symmetries and are increasing ecological vulnerability. So, I always think while thinking or foregrounding environmental issues, it is difficult not to think how the local, regional, or national politics is entangled with the priorities of so called growth for a society, but not necessarily with all sections in mind. So it's not one thing. As an artist, it's very difficult to say at what level or to what extent art can have a real echo, you know. But as a citizen or as a creative person, I'm not segregated from the social system that I live in and am affected by. And also considering the state of politics in our immediate environment in India and other parts of the world, I do think that speaking through art is a way of resistance to political power. I don't know how relevant it is here, but I would like to mention here is that while thinking of my beautiful experiences of being in forests, especially in sal forest during its flowering times, I'm always reminded of sal forests cut by the Adivasis for making the iron from its ore, you know, from a long time, for thousands of years. Because the best quality coal needed for making iron came from burning the sal logs. So, anthropogenic interventions have been much older than 300 years or so. Yet, when one goes deeper into the question, one notices that the local people's requirement was only for the tools or the objects used in rituals, etc. So, at what scale did they exploit nature for themselves is to be understood. But the speed at which we are moving at is alarming. You know, I'm going back and forth, and I feel it's relevant to discuss this. How, apart from what I just discussed about Adivasis, cutting sal forests for hundreds of years or thousands of years, concept of deep ecology can still be sensed in certain practices of the Adivasi culture, you know, especially in their rituals and festivals, myths or orally sung epics in which non-human has its own identity and independent status. I have incorporated a conversation between a spider and a human in one of my work, Samtal Jameen, Samtal Jameer, you know. So my research on microbiota shows that indigenous people who still live closer to nature and depend upon food from the forest have much healthier gut microbiotas.
Amrita, do you want to ask the question about grit and its use in Western modernism?
Yes, it's interesting because before that, it's the thing that Najrin, you talked about trans-species solidarity. It's also deeply interlinked with planetary citizenship. I think that is what Navjot has also been trying and working towards, this kind of an idea of a planetary citizenship, which is, I think, the way forward, if we have to address the precarity that we are in now. And also the fact of the affective and the intuitive and the emotion that goes behind in each imagery that she's drawing upon, or that, so that's the point. I mean, the whole thing of the intuitive, and when I come from the intuitive, if I have to come to the way she uses abstraction, and it's interesting, like across your many bodies of work, you have used the grid in such a probing way. Yes, of course, it is about ways of seeing, perceiving, perceptual tools, probing perceptual tools, and it is also, I think, it was like the insertion of yourself into that grid is also like a feminist insertion, a wedge into the very modernist, masculinist grid system, and you have definitely spoken about the way you have employed the grid But here I would like to ask is that how have you questioned the grid, in your work, and since the grid has been one of the metaphors from the modernist to the conceptual in Western art, so how have you looked at the grid, questioned the grid, probed the grid, collapsed the grid in many ways? And then it comes back here even in this COVID induced series, where it becomes again a sort of a window, and where you open up a window to look outside. So if you could just sort of talk a little bit about it, but immediately we'll be getting answers about the way you have sort of probed abstraction and through a feminist lens.
I've said this before that I see the grid as a matrix to map the contradictory or conflicting present day and historical links. But here in these works, I've used graphs. So the openings or cuts in the graphs are also to question interventions. You see, during COVID, one hardly had any physical contact with people outside. So the graphs of different density can be seen as metaphors for the psychological and the physical grill. And stepping out here is more like wanting to sense a situation as one couldn't go out. And as you know, TV gave us many versions of the same news, depending upon channels' own political stands and affiliation with certain parties. So how does one choose an image? What does an image from the media do when seen in the context of art? I was reading Boris Groys, and so there were many relevant writings at that time. I chose images which moved me. A glass of water, repeated in many works, is to express my empathy towards people in those situations. I value emotions and what moves me intensely.
Thank you, Navjot and Najrin. And I think we have sort of drawn out a lot of things which, apart from the questions. Najrin, you have anything else to add?
Thank you so much, Navjot, for all your responses and for having walked us through your process, your impulse, all the insights that are attendant to your works, not only as part of cognitive processes, but also your entire oeuvre. Amrita, thank you so much for your questions to Navjot and for being such a great discussant.
Equally felt, Najrin. Thank you, because I think the questions were also framed together, with you. And I think that also brought in, different kind of element to the questions themselves. But thank you, Navjot. And I think it has also been very, very insightful, because a lot of things came up in the discussion, which has also enriched me, deeper into your practice. Thank you so much.
And my thanks to both of you for engaging with my work. Thank you. And thank you, Jui, for organizing this conversation on behalf of the Guild.